Welcome to Season 6 of Purposeful Empathy, a show dedicated to amplifying the voices of people from across the globe who believe the world needs more empathy and are doing something about it. Today's episode is brought to you by Grand Huron International, an on-demand coaching provider for individuals and companies. Thanks for watching. Enjoy the show. So welcome to a new episode of Purposeful Empathy. Today I'm joined by the fabulous Sandi Boucher, who is an internationally recognized and beloved speaker and the author of The Path. She is an Ojibwe woman and proud member of the Seine River Nation who knows full well the devastation of colonialism, alcoholism, and domestic violence. Sandi supports both sides of reconciliation by creating safe spaces for Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples alike. Welcome to the show, Sandi.
Thank you for having me. This is going to be awesome. I just know it.
Oh, I can't wait too. And I know it will be awesome because I've seen your work. Thank you so much. You were a guest speaker in my class this semester, and you did a truth and reconciliation dialogue with 40 students who I think really integrated the important work that reconciliation requires and the investment that's required. So thank you so much for doing that and then for joining me again today. I'll start with this. I think there was this moment in time early last summer after George Floyd was murdered, that there was like this collective and international day of reckoning that systemic racism and Black Lives Matter, like we got to do something now. Yeah. And I feel like there was a similar moment where there was just this zeitgeist reverberating across Canada when the bodies of the children in Kamloops were recovered. Can you speak to what Canadians should know about reconciliation, please?
It's amazing how many people I meet, non-Indigenous Canadians I meet, that still believe reconciliation is going to be some act of legislation. And it's like, no. The way I describe reconciliation, what it means to me or what it's going to take, in my opinion, is a million conversations, a million questions, and a million answers, a million step forwards, and probably about 500,000 backwards because we're going to step in the wrong direction. But it's going to be relationship building. It's going to be, I don't understand, and trying to understand. It is literally repairing and building a relationship where there hasn't been one in the past, which is why so many people have an issue with the word reconciliation, because they'll point out, well, it was never a good relationship, so what are we reconciling? And that's what we're reconciling. And I agree with you as far as Kamloops is concerned, because I've been doing this work for many, many years, and always there was this disbelief. There were people that weren't even really sure the residential school era happened. Like, really? I don't know. And the answer was always, or the excuse was, I wasn't taught about this in school, so it couldn't possibly have happened. And like you, I saw the tide turn when the children were discovered. And I believe, for one, I wish those kids had never been taken. And I think I have to be crystal clear on that, whether they survived and got to go home or they didn't. They should have never been taken. But if those kids couldn't come home, I can't help thinking that we needed something that traumatic, that huge, 215 children to wake Canada up. Because what happened, it shook the Canadian identity. Up until that point, internationally, we were the people that were friendly to everyone and said sorry way too much and please and thank you. And Canadians were stunned, they were shocked, and they didn't know what to do with the information. And I didn't know what they were going to do, even though I'm a motivational speaker and I tend to, err on the side of it's going to turn out okay. I wasn't sure. And time and time and time again, they reached out to Indigenous and said, help us understand. And some of us were able to, and some of us understandably couldn't because it was so hard. And I know I had to take my time to heal first before I could answer questions. And it's still happening is what I love, because I thought, is this going to be a week of interest and then we're going back to the norm? I am still booked solid, and it's all with non-Indigenous people asking, please help me understand. So
what I'm glad to hear that that's a sustained interest in learning about what can be done. I also know from friends who are Black saying, gosh, it became a bit of a burden where white friends would reach out to me and say, I want to learn more. What do I have to do? And so, friends would put together like a list of books, like, here, do the work. So, I mean, you're in this field, your professional commitment is to do this education. But what is something else that non-Indigenous people should know when it comes to asking Indigenous people to share, like, what they should do to move a reconciliation dialogue forward?
And I love that you asked that, because the answer is so incredibly important. You don't get to choose. You, as in non-Indigenous Canadian, do not get to choose what Indigenous person is going to answer that question for you. Because there are people like me who have put ourselves into this realm because we're ready to do this work. But when I do my seminars, I am always pleading with my participants, ask me, do not leave here and just ask the poor, innocent, next Indigenous person you see, because they may not have had the healing opportunities that I've had. They're not going to see you coming. They're like, when I show up for seminar, I expect the questions. I know what I'm walking into. So you don't get to decide who the teacher will be. But an easy Google search will show you the Indigenous people that are out there trying to educate people. And those are the people you should reach out to with questions.
So you've done your own work as somebody who's in this space, but also as a human being, not just as an Indigenous leader. I want to ask about your backstory, if you would share a little bit so that we understand the complexity of who you are, Sandi, and sort of, what you've transcended to really be in this space as somebody who's kind of post-traumatic growth and helping other people along that journey.
Yeah, so I am definitely one of those really annoying people that believe that everything happens for a reason. And I get kicked back on that all the time because horrific things happen. I happen to think that those horrific things can be some of our biggest life-changing moments. So my life kind of Reader's Digest version here, I grew up in a really beautiful home. My parents happened to be a beautiful Anishnaabe from Couchiching First Nation and a Frenchman from Saint-Jérôme, Quebec. And I tell everyone now, I was literally born to do reconciliation work because in my home, I saw two cultures totally coexisting with each other. My dad had zero interest in changing who my mom was. He loved how she looked at the trees and the water in a way that he would never think of. And she loved that he supported and believed in her, right? So they were this soulmate existence. But when I was only 17, my dad passed away. And anyone who would have known me back then, they would have told you I was this confident, straight A student. Well, hindsight is 2020, right? I know I wasn't confident at all because I didn't believe in me. I believed in my dad's version of me. He said I could walk on water, so I could walk on water. He told me I could be prime minister one day if I wanted to be. Okay, then if Dad would never lie to me. Dad became what I now call my first projector. And if you think of the projectors we use in seminar that shoots the image up onto the screen, he was the projector and I was just living the image that he projected. But then the projector went out. So I made the mistake that way too many women of many different nationalities make. I went looking for another projector. I didn't yet realize that I could be my own projector. And I always say that when you're in that mindset, you could easily find Jack the Ripper. And I came really close. So I ended up, I'm a 10-year domestic abuse survivor, and I could traumatize your audience so easily with hundreds of different stories of things that I've survived and had my 2 children in the middle of it. So after 10 years, I now have like a 5 and a 7-year-old. I realized like enough, I need to get out of here. I can remember distinctly after one episode when I was spending the night in yet another shelter for abused women, trying to comfort my children. I remember hearing this voice, and I'm certain it was just the thought of my mom. And I'd heard that you're not meant to be here. Like, this is not what your path was meant to be. You have to change your decision making because you were meant for more than this. So I came out of that relationship. And unfortunately, in my bio, it talks about, I understand the effects of colonialism. There's a lot of people in this country who believe Indigenous women are just there for the use of whoever wants to use us, that we don't have the right or the power to say no. And the domestic relationships, the domestic abusive relationships I were in, that's the support, that's the kind of comments I heard, that, you know, my partner wasn't Indigenous. So he was trying to bring me up into society, and I should be thankful for this. And it was just, no. And I watched my family get blown apart by alcohol time and time again. And my dad was one of those guys that had 1 beer after work every day. And that was my experience with alcohol. I had no idea what alcoholism could do to a family until I was up to my neck in it. So I came out of that, and all through all of this, I had my career. I was always working. I knew I was intelligent. I wanted to bring in money to help look after my children. And when relationships ended, definitely needed to depend on that income. So I always had that playing for me. And I met other strong Indigenous women and kind of just sat in the background going like, could I have a voice one day? And just over time and being surrounded by these strong women who had done their own healing and going through different ceremonies, I did mine. And now that I do reconciliation work and I try to explain to people what reconciliation is like, it's actually in my book. I use the quiz that you take to determine if you're in a domestic violence situation, to describe the relationship between Canada and Indigenous people. And anyone who's ever survived that, you know how hard it is to try to make peace with your ex-partner because you have children that you share, or custody, access, whatever it is. That's what Canada is asking of Indigenous peoples. You say you want to reconcile with us, but you've been hurting us for how long? Words are easy. Actions. We need to see change in action. So, and that again is why I do this work, because I know the magnitude of this work. And it can't just be minimized or made convenient. If it's convenient, it's not reconciliation at all, because reconciliation is inconvenient. The one reason I wrote the book, The Path, that you had mentioned, was the fact that I was watching all these politicians who, to me, they all seem to be white men, affluent men, were talking about what we needed to do for reconciliation. And at that time, I was living in Toronto. And I honestly felt like I wanted to climb on the top of my office building and scream out to the world, you're asking the wrong people. You do not get to hurt us and then you decide how to fix it. That's not how reconciliation works. We're the hurt and injured party. We tell you what we need to make this better. And the fact that every Indigenous person, every community, every nation is different means there's no pan-Canadian solution. There's not going to be one piece of legislation because families and people were hurt. And that's emotional. We can't take the emotion out of this. And that's why I think Kamloops really brought it home, because that was emotional. There was no logical explanation for that. But if we understand the weight and the magnitude of this, then we can honestly start working and moving in the right direction.
Yeah, and I think it's because I'm learning more that I understand. For example, it's in the recent news that the Pope is planning to come to Canada, and that is a symbolic gesture. But I can completely appreciate why some people are like, yeah, too late. Like little, too late. And I don't want to be anywhere near this because it'll just re-traumatize me. And so it's very complex and everybody has the right to respond to it differently.
100%. And other people so need to hear that. Like, for example, when the original official apology from the Canadian federal government was aired, I took the day off from work so I could sit and watch that. My mom had already passed away at that time. I bawled my eyes out listening to that, only because, one, I wish my mom had been there to hear it, because she would have bet her last buck that it was never going to happen. And two, to hear the honesty of the apology. Now, the aftermath after it was not, it didn't pay homage to that apology, but they didn't deny it. As an Indigenous person sitting there going like, are they actually really admitting to this? Because I had already lived 40 years of denial from our government. For them to actually say it out loud, I had the same reaction when I went to the Human Rights Museum in Winnipeg, to walk through that first level and see the blatant truth when no one trying to whitewash it or minimize it. I bawled my way all through the first level too, just because of the absolute honesty. So I think for some people, yes, the apology seems weak and too little too late. But I know elders, survivors that need to hear those words. And I think for them, if it can happen, it needs to happen.
And I feel like I have a lot of hope because the newer generation, the Gen Zs, have just a different set of values around diversity, inclusion, and equity. And, you know, for them, changing the name of a sports team is like a no-brainer if there's a chance that it might hurt people. You know, toppling some statues that, you know, are in some parks that revere a government official, a leader from some time ago, but that actually wounds Indigenous people as they walk by, or racialized people as they walk by. Like, you know, they just get it. So I feel like there's, you know, momentum on the side of reconciliation. And yet, even like, you know, it's kind of mind-boggling to, you know, Canada celebrated or marked the first official day of reconciliation. And the leader of the country that purports to care so much about Indigenous communities was on vacation. So there's still a lot of work to do.
Well, and I want to be just my 2 cents to add into that. Yes, I see a lot of the younger people in the country, exactly like you said, they get it. Bring down the statue, change the name, they get it. Having said that, I've also met many, many youth that are not necessarily college or university educated. They're repeating exactly what their parents are saying. So it really depends. I don't think we can say an entire generation has changed, because it really depends on their experiences and who they're getting their education from, whether it's a formal education or their family members. And as far as our good old Prime Minister, I've actually had someone just this week in seminar ask me, we were talking about, what nonprofits could do, what individuals could do, what businesses could do. And they brought up the question, well, what about the government? Should they be spearheading this? Was the comment. And my honest response was, if we wait for the government, then this is never going to happen, because it's going to be the momentum of the people that change this. The government will catch up. Because honestly, the federal government's taking Cindy Blackstock to court right now. They're fighting the compensation of Indigenous children in care. You cannot say that you're pro-reconciliation while you're denying care to Indigenous children. It just doesn't make sense. So the government is not who we should be looking to for leadership in this case, especially since the residential schools were government sanctioned. So.
Today's episode was brought to you by Grand Huron International, an on-demand coaching provider for individuals and companies. Yeah. So I wonder if you could speak to, you do work with non-Indigenous people to help them, build bridges and do the work of reconciliation, but you also do work with Indigenous people. Yeah. And I wonder whether or not you could talk a little bit about what internalized racism or internalized oppression looks like, and how you unpack that, and how empathy plays a role in finding your way out of that.
Oh, 100%. And you know what? You said that, and I heard my mom, and that happens so often. So the easiest way to introduce this is one of my mom's teachings, one of her stories. So she used to always tell me that if I see someone doing something, making a decision that I would never make, like I just don't understand what they're doing, then she would say, instead of going to judgment, stop and ask yourself, how much would I have to be hurting? How scared would I have to be? How alone? How overwhelmed? How terrified would I have to be for me to think that's a good decision? And she said, when we go there, then we're getting closer to building the bridge with these people. So that's what I do in our First Nations communities. For one, they have not been educated on what oppression does to a human being, what internalized oppression is, the fact that if you've been oppressed long enough, you're going to internalize this. They don't know that there's 3 natural human reactions. And if you look at any marginalized group, you're going to see these reactions. The first one is violence. Violence against someone. If you keep telling someone they're never going to amount to anything, or they're less than, they're lashing out at somebody. Unfortunately, what always happens is they're not lashing out against the oppressor, because the oppressor is not in the room with them. It's hard to hit the federal government. So unfortunately, that means they're lashing out against the people closest to them, whether that's their partner, and we're seeing crazy numbers in domestic violence, whether it's their friends and the addictions are playing into this, or it's their children. So we see the violence in the marginalized communities, and people look at that from the outside and why don't they get it together? It's like, what? That's a natural human reaction to what happened to them. Now, for a lot of people, they think violence is like the worst one. We really don't want to see that. And to me, it just isn't. Because to me, if someone's being violent, that means there's still some little flame inside them that is saying, you can't talk to me like that. I don't need to take this. There's still some kind of fight. The second natural human reaction is the one that scares me, and that's acquiescence. That's the complete and total giving up. That's the people that say, why bother going to school? It's never going to change. They're never going to accept me. They're never going to hire me. I have dark skin. I have a niche sounding last name. Why? It's never going to change. That Canada's never going to look at us differently. That's the one that scares me, because that's our people lost to the streets. That's people that turn to, drugs and alcohol and end up in these horrible addictive situations. So that I help them identify that in the community so they stop judging each other, because that's another symptom of internalized oppression, that turning on each other. That's a form of violence. The last one is the one I'm encouraging everyone to do, and that's nonviolent resistance. And I always point out to Canadians, we know that you hate it when a community blocks a highway or blocks a railway track, but that's a lot better option than the first two. And if they're doing that, it's not because it's the first time they've tried to bring this to Canadians' attention. It's probably the 50th time. And that's just a sign of how frustrated they are. So I don't know if you've seen it on YouTube. There's many different First Nation communities where the youth got together and actually did music videos to talk about their communities and the pride they feel, even though their communities are challenged. That's nonviolent resistance. I don't know how many people I've heard are walking to Ottawa to bring attention to whatever issues happening in their community. All of those are healthy forms of nonviolent resistance. I always tell my participants, I'm going to ruin the 6 o'clock news for you, because now you're going to see these things happening and you're going to go, oh, that's violence. Oh, that's nonviolent resistance, right? Which is understanding. And that's building the bridges we need.
Mm-hmm. And right now is COP26. And, how many COPs do we need before we figure out that climate change is right here with devastating consequences, and Indigenous communities around the globe have honored Earth. They understand nature. They think 7 generations down the pike, right? So I just feel there's so much wisdom from the Indigenous communities globally. I wonder if there's anything that you could share from your lineage that speaks to empathy. What is some Indigenous ways of thinking about empathy?
And just speaking about that for a second, one of our biggest teachings that always comes up in reconciliation work is humility. So humility is a huge part of Anishinaabe teachings, and that's what we need to see from Canadians. When I have non-Indigenous people coming to me going, I don't understand, my brain instantly goes to, I can work with that. I can give you education. The ones that are problematic are the ones that think they do, and I've got the solution. That's scary. How could you? You've never been in the First Nations community. So we are stewards of the planet because we think of the earth as Mother Earth. And I'll never forget it. I have a story to share with you. This was years ago. I was on a plane. Strange things happen on a plane. I was on a plane on the way to a seminar. This young man, probably late 20s, very well dressed, very professional, sat down next to me in a friendly enough type. We started talking. Here he was in university for business. He was flying home for reading week, and he was very interested in my work. And out of the blue, of course, I have a question. Can I ask you? I was like, oh, here we go. This always happens. What's going to be the question? And his question was around the term Mother Earth. And he's like, I've heard it 100 times, but I don't understand Mother Earth. Like, what does this mean to you? And I was like, easy, I can do this. How much would I have to pay you for you to allow me to take out your mom's kidneys? And he looked at me totally, completely shocked. And he was like, you're not, like, you can't pay me enough. And I said, now you know how I feel about mining. Because we believe that Mother Earth gives us everything we need to survive, the air, the water, the land, we can grow things. It's amazing. And in turn, we have to protect her so she can keep doing that for next generations. So to me, as an Anishinaabe Kwe, if it's going to damage the water, the air, or the land, I don't care how much money it's going to make. The price is too high. Because the people who are going to pay it are my great-grandchildren, and I won't be here to protect them. And I'm just not willing to do that.
I mean, it's just, of course we have to move back to that model of seeing the world. Of course we do. It's super at odds with the hegemonic capitalist system.
Yeah.
But look at where it got us, right?
Yeah. And we are, like, I love the fact the ego of non-Indigenous people is the one that always blows me away. Because again, I was raised in this humility teaching. I don't know more than a deer or a moose or a squirrel. Because you watch them, they don't need the 6 o'clock news to tell them winter's coming. They know it and they prepare for it. They know danger. They know where food is. They fit perfectly in the environment. And we used to, until we were egotistical enough to think we should change it for our convenience. Nothing blows my mind more than developing a community. They tear down all the trees, they put in the streets and the houses, and then what do? Plant trees. And it's like, what? The trees were there, right? The water, the fact that we believe you can damage a river and it's not going to affect everything else. We understand the interconnectedness of everything. In the same way, the human body, you can't take medication for one part of your body and not have it affect other parts. We know this. I believe, and the way I've always looked at it is when mankind can build a system, like an ecosystem or a human body system, then we can start believing that we know more than creator. Until then, we got to back it up and start protecting what we need. We think we're higher on the evolution chain than the animals. They're not destroying what they need to survive. We are. Mm-hmm. And I've heard a bunch of people say, you know, that they're worried we're going to destroy the planet. I don't believe that's going to happen. What we're going to do is destroy us. Mother Earth will protect herself. And if that means at some point it's us that have to leave, that's what's going to happen. The environment will change so that we can't sustain ourselves. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And unfortunately for Indigenous people, we've seen climate change coming. When you're up north like I am, and even further north, we have remote communities that are flying communities. You can't drive in. And they're dependent on what we call the ice roads. So when the lakes freeze over, they can bring the huge transports over the lake. It's the only way to get in building equipment or anything that's heavy. You can't put that on a plane. We used to have 4 months, 5 months of ice roads. Now they're looking at 2.5, where the ice is thick enough to take the trucks coming over. So those communities are now going without those materials because you can't get them in. That's climate change.
So I think my takeaway from this, as it relates to empathy, is that empathy transcends the interpersonal, and empathy for all living creatures and the entire human system, or the entire natural system. We need to empathize with all of it for all of us to flourish. That's what I'm taking away from this.
And like for me, and I know this is going to sound crazy to some people listening, and it is definitely my Indigenous worldview. But like, for example, outside the city where I live, they're doing construction on the highway. They're extending one of the lanes. To see Mother Earth ripped open like that, they did the drilling. They did, you know, they blew up things to make it possible to go through the rocks. Breaks my heart to see that, to me, like the trees are hurting, the ground is hurting. Like, what are you doing? Why? So we can get there 5 minutes faster? Like, really, are we so important that we're going to destroy things just for convenience? And it always comes down to convenience. But you ask anyone who's struggling with mental health issues or relationship issues, there is such a benefit to sitting next to the water or sitting under a tree. It is proven healing capacities to those events. That's what we're destroying. You look at the people who live in the cities and they're struggling. That's because they've been removed so far from anything that's living that they don't even feel like they are anymore. And that's an Anishinaabe teaching, that we become like what we surround ourselves with. If you surround yourself with concrete and brick and pavement, there is no life there. But go sit under a tree and just breathe. We're not supposed to get our energy from each other. We're supposed to get it from the trees and the plants. And we're killing ourselves by trying to build these communities that are convenient.
Sandi, oh my gosh. I still have 2 questions before we say goodbye.
Okay.
You have been so generous. This has been such a great conversation. So, a few semesters ago, at the beginning of the semester, my slide would go up and I would do a land acknowledgement. And it wasn't until this semester where I realized, I think I am performing. I'm in a performative moment here, putting up the slide like, a good progressive would do, without really taking stock of what I was doing. And because the theme of the semester is the truth and reconciliation, I was like, okay, this time I'm going to really be a lot more thoughtful about it. And instead of, which I had done in the past, like, looked at McGill's land acknowledgement, or I don't know, Googled land acknowledgement and sort of like cut and paste something that I thought just, voila. I really thought about my land acknowledgement, and I even sent it to an Indigenous elder in a community off the island of Montreal saying, could you take a look? Like, I'd really appreciate you validating, whether this has some resonance. And then, thinking, oh yeah, okay, I think I've done justice to the land acknowledgement. Then I had you guest speak in my class and talk about humility and talk about, working with people who are willing to learn. I was asking whether or not you were going to do a land acknowledgement, because otherwise I wasn't going to do mine. And you were like, well, I don't think I'm going to do a land acknowledgement. And it wasn't until like I thought about that for a second. I was like, yeah, of course you're not going to do a land acknowledgement, right? So I just wonder if you could share your thoughts about land acknowledgements for people who are kind of maybe thinking about it, leaning into it, like some guidance around that.
Okay. So as I was saying before when we were chatting, that I get requests almost daily from someone, the exact same thing. This is my land acknowledgement. Can you look it over? What do you think? And in the last maybe 2 weeks, I've just started doing this, and now it's the same response every single time. I email them back and I say, okay, first question, why are you doing a land acknowledgement? And what I'm trying to determine, because my rule is, if all you're doing for reconciliation is a land acknowledgement, don't bother doing it, because then it is just performative. It has to be part of a bigger plan. So if they come back with me and it's like, yes, we want to do this, we've been working on our Indigenous engagement policies and we're working with the local community, okay, they're obviously doing some solid work. And then I come back with, okay, what do you want to say? Because there is, as you said yourself, if you just Google some words, there's no meaning to that. But as an entity, as a person, what do you want to say? What is your commitment? What are you working towards or willing to do? That's what a land acknowledgement has to be, not some generic worrying about using the right word. Authentic. It has to be honest. It has to be a commitment, because when I hear a land acknowledgement, I want to hear what else you're doing. Prove to me you're in allyship, and that's action based.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, thank you for that. Last question, Sandi. I ask this of all my guests at the end of our show, or at the end of the conversation. If you can think of a time when you were on the receiving end of empathy and what that meant for you.
And, you know, I'm going to run with the first one that came to mind when you asked me that question. And it's funny because I work so hard and constantly trying to get other people to be more empathetic of the Indigenous reality, that I was at an event and I shared my personal history. And in response, one of my participants it was so obvious that it was heartfelt. It wasn't just a kickback answer, but she just looked at me and said, I am so sorry that ever happened to you. And I kind of just stopped in my tracks and, okay, I wasn't expecting that. And immediately did what so many of us do. Yeah. Oh, well, thank you for that. And I was going to go on and she wouldn't let me. And she brought it back and she's like, no, no, thank you so much. I know you're here to try to help us, but I am so sorry that happened to you. And it was so genuine, so heartfelt that it almost brought me to tears, because in that moment, because I've told my story so many times and I'm so focused on helping other people, it reminded me that journey, even though I survived it and I'm confident that I'm stronger than it, that it wasn't easy and that it's okay to acknowledge that. So,
yeah, that's a beautiful story. Thank you so much for sharing. Thank you for spending your afternoon in conversation with me. It's been a pleasure and a delight and an honor, and keep doing the work. I'll have all sorts of information about how people can get in touch with you in the description below, information about your book and your services. Thank you so much, Sandi.
Thank you. I just wanted to say one last thing, and I say this to every non-Indigenous audience or person I get to work with. And I mean this from the bottom of my heart. You are my fuel. You, I take into the communities with me. When I'm working with First Nations people and they still don't believe that non-Indigenous Canadians care, I get to tell them about you. I get to tell them about this conversation and the last seminar I did and all the amazing Canadians that are trying to understand. So even though you don't understand yet, please don't minimize how important it is that you're trying, because we see you and we appreciate it.
That is just such a tender note of reconciliation. And I'm really moved by that. Thank you so much. And thank you all to everyone who's watching and listening. We'll see you next week at Purposeful Empathy. What if you had access to your own council of coaches to help you break free from your thinking clutter, make that important decision, and liberate you from whatever's holding you back? At Grand Huron International, you get to choose the coach of your choice anytime from anywhere. Visit grandhuroninternational.com and harness the power of on-demand coaching today.